You're here at Code Red, What's Needed to Tackle Domestic Violence Crisis. We're joined by 4 incredible panellists. Rosie Batty, who's a critical leader in the campaign to tackle family violence in Australia. She's our Australian of the Year, has established the Luke Batty Foundation and is a founding member of the government's advisory panel on preventing violence against women. We have Antoinette Braybrook, who's an Aboriginal woman who was born in Victoria on Wurundjeri country. Her grandmother and mother's line are through Kukuyalangi in North Queensland. Antoinette is a lawyer and the national convener for the National Family Violence Prevention Legal Services Forum, which comprises 13 units servicing 31 high-need regional and remote areas in Australia. We have Fiona McCormack, the CEO of Domestic Violence Victoria, the peak body for family violence services for women and children that provides political advocacy on behalf of and in partnership with member organisations for violence prevention, systemic change and enhancement of systems. And Paul Lenossier, the CEO of Our Watch, the National Foundation for the Prevention of Violence Against Women and Their Children. Previously, Paul co-led the whole of government vulnerable children strategy team and has also previously worked in a wide range of senior roles across youth, family services and the Department of Education. Right now, Australia is in the grips of a domestic violence crisis. 24 women have died already this year as a result of domestic and family violence. A woman is hospitalised every 3 hours. At the same time, thousands of women are being turned away from the services that are supposed to keep them safe, and we've just spent 3 months fighting to reverse federal funding cuts that were set to hit critical frontline services. It's a horrifying state of affairs. So I wanted to start with a question that if we're to look forward to where we want and need to be, painting a picture of the outcomes we need to be working towards, what does real long-term change on men's violence against women look like? Rosie, can I ask you to kick off? Or is that... It's me. No.
Am I on? That's yes. Better, yeah. Well, I think Fiona and Antoinette and Paul would be far better equipped to answer this question, but I'll give it a go. So what was the question again? It was a very long question. What will it look like? What does
long-term change look like?
Well, what does long-term change look like? But what it has to look like is a reversal of statistics. We currently are experiencing 2 women a week being murdered by their partner or ex-partner. We have to see that decline. That is 1 woman a week more than this time last year. So when we look at how is it that the incidences of violence are apparently increasing and getting worse, what it has to look like is prevention. It has to look like where we tackle our school systems and we look to work with the school communities in helping children understand that violence in the home is violence just as seriously as violence on the street. We need to look at our sporting organisations so that the modelling of sports heroes reflects respect to women, and sexist attitudes and derogatory behaviours are now no longer really not popular, that we actually stand up and tackle and challenge people whose behaviour is what we now know to be inappropriate and unacceptable. So, long term, it's about it no longer being a secret behind closed doors. It's a topic that we all now totally understand the epidemic of. We're all very clear what the myths are, what the stigmas are, and the future has to include greater perpetrator accountability and supports for victims who do seek to live in safety, that they are believed, that they're supported, and that the onus of is not continue to be placed on their shoulders, that we really look at perpetrators and how we look at interventions to stop the escalating behaviours.
Antoinette, a number that often gets less media attention is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are 34 times more likely to be hospitalised as a result of family violence, and yet specialist and culturally safe services are often underfunded. What does change look like from your perspective?
Sorry. I need to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're gathering on today and pay my respects to their elders past and present before I speak. I also would like to acknowledge all of the women who have died at the hands of men and pay a particular acknowledgement to Rosie and thank you for all of your advocacy. I also need to say that I'm standing here or sitting here as an Aboriginal woman, and I'm not the voice of every woman in our community, but I am the voice of women that we've been working with in our communities for more than 13 years. And so the information that I will give you today will come from that. And in terms of the long-term change in our communities, I think up front we need to, as a community, acknowledge that family violence is a gendered crime, and we need to be able to vocalise that in our communities. There's not too many people, organisations in our communities that do that. I mean, I think it is acknowledged that women are the victims of family violence, but when we're talking about family violence, we're not talking about it as being a gendered crime. So that's one real big change that I need to see. And then the longer term commitment and investment into programs is absolutely essential. I'm not sure if any of you know or have heard about the Prime Minister for Women and Indigenous Issues implementation of the Indigenous Advancement Strategy and how helpful that was to us. You know, that put our organisation and the other 12, 13 organisations nationally who work with victims of family violence under extreme pressure to apply, go through an open tender process to apply for funding for the work that we've been doing for so long, and only to come out at the other end with the same level of funding that we have had in the previous financial year. And for those of us that got 3 years funding, it's going to remain the same for the next 3 years, and that is even without any CPI increase. So that's a real concern for us. The demand is there, family violence is there, but yet there's very little commitment from our government.
Fiona?
Yeah. I guess for me what it would look like is that we would have addressed some of the structural predeterminants of violence against women. So, you know, like going back to the 60s and 70s, and the things that we asked for then that we still really haven't kind of achieved. So equal pay, accessible and affordable housing, equal number of women and men in well-paying jobs, accessible and affordable childcare, equal number of women in government, etc. So all those structural factors that generate discrimination and inequality and mean that women are more dependent, which means that they're more vulnerable to violence. And then, I guess, apart from the structural factors, what it would look like is that we would have addressed some of the social conditions that allows violence against women. So we'd see a redefining of social expectations around, say, women beyond primarily sex objects or mothers, but really genuine respect and evidence that women play really important roles in our society and make significant contributions, and redefining masculinities so that we're not making men less men, but challenging concepts of masculinity that are tied up with disrespect to women or belief that women are objects or possessions or that men have a right to control. And I guess the last thing it would look like for me would be that when violence against women does occur in our community, that there's a response from us as a broader community that violence against women is not acceptable, that we don't make excuses or justifications, we don't shy away from ensuring that men are responsible, men who choose to use violence are responsible for their behaviour, but also that it's, funded, it's given the attention that's required from governments.
Fantastic. Paul, prevention is obviously a really big part of this picture. Do you want to speak to what the ideal future looks like from your perspective?
Thanks, Renee. I think Fiona did a really good job of describing those key determinants of the things that sit behind, create cultures that allow violence to be perpetuated. The obvious end point is in Australia where women and children can live free from violence. But there are little things which are extremely powerful that can be very telling indicators of that. So when someone says at a sporting competition, player X is playing like a girl, it'll be a time where that's regarded as a compliment rather than a put down. It'll be a time when the CEOs of corporate Australia and not-for-profit Australia and public service Australia are able to talk in a confronting way with their workforce in a similar way that Lieutenant General David Morrison did. And what will be particularly telling about that is that 52% of those CEOs will be women. And again, as Fiona pointed out, a key telling point will be that lifetime and retirement or superannuation savings, lifetime income and earnings and superannuation savings for women will be on a par with that for men. Because the time we will be in will be a time where we have genuinely achieved gender equality, a time where men and women together will be citizens in a society that values common good and a society that is not only looks to the best outcomes for itself, but sees itself as working towards best outcomes globally. So we are international citizens, we're equal citizens in this country, and men and women together live out that equal citizenhood.
Disappointingly, we're obviously a long way from that. What do people see as the key barriers we need to overcome in the short and medium term to achieve that kind of change? Maybe Fiona?
I think one of the barriers is that despite us being a fairly well-educated community, despite us having loads of information available to us, we're still very behind in terms of understanding the causes of violence against women. So we still commonly get asked about why doesn't she just leave, or what about men who are abused, things like that. So I guess one of the challenges for us is to really generate an understanding amongst the community about the causes, and for people to feel confident about that. Sometimes we see men who choose to use violence perpetrate violence. It's high-profile men, and they can take a period of time out, and then they're back on our screens or on our playing fields. And I think people can feel uncomfortable because we don't want to point the finger at somebody. We want to, if something's in the past, we want to give people a second chance, be forgiving, etc. But I guess that's important if people have shown remorse or taken responsibility for their actions. And that so rarely happens. And that sends really, really strong messages to women who are victims of violence against women, that the community don't really take it very seriously. It sends really strong messages to men that we don't really take it very seriously. And so I think that, we need to get better as a community about feeling confident, about expecting that men who have chosen to use violence, and keeping in mind that family violence is never just a one-off incident, it's not an explosion of rage, it's not, and rape isn't sort of poor impulse control or, uncontrollable sexual desires. These are deliberate acts to intimidate, to terrify, to control. So I think that's one of the barriers that we need to overcome, getting people to understand the issue and also feel more confident in knowing what they can do and in acting. I think a second barrier to overcome is getting the government to understand their role in challenging the conditions that allows violence against women to flourish or creating gender equity. So often I think we think government sees particularly prevention work as something that can be outsourced. They can fund community organisations to work on prevention and that'll be delivered. But so much of what we need in relation to addressing violence against women sits with government, those things that relate to gender equality. So I'd really like to see a really strong Office of Women's Policy in our governments that's providing a gendered lens to a whole range of different government work, not just in terms of how they operate, but in their policy, financial policy, political, social policy. And the last thing, I had another one. I've forgotten, so there you go. I'll pass it on to who wants to go next.
The barriers is that we still don't recognise that violence happens to people like us. I think everybody seems to think it happens to other people. It happens to poor neighbourhoods. And it really is quite confronting to find out that actually it can happen to people in any profession, no matter how intelligent, how big their home is, how successful they are in their career. So I think that's a big barrier for people at this point, is actually realising that no one is immune, violence doesn't discriminate, you can be affected, or a family member can be affected, and it crosses all those cultural barriers as well. So also the myths surrounding violence, in that we look to blame, and as Antoinette said, we have to be really clear that it is a gender issue, but we look to blame mental illness, we look to blame drug and alcohol abuse, we look to blame other factors. It's very confronting for people to seem to understand, whether it's men or women, that this is a gender issue, that is a decision, that is a choice, and violence is the choice that they choose to make. So I think that, we've certainly got a long way to go to also understand the different forms of violence, that we still find it difficult to believe or take as seriously psychological abuse. We still don't see the evidence of financial abuse and how it raises its head in many ways. So we're looking, we take more seriously the physical abuse, but we've still got to really understand that every form of abuse is as debilitating, is as dangerous, and we have to make sure that every policeman in every police station in every area of Australia understands what family violence is and supports the victims and believes the victims. We need to make sure that every court and every judge and magistrate in every court respects the victim, believes the victim, and takes just as seriously an incidence of family violence as they do as seriously violence on the street. So we've got a big shifting for people to understand that violence is violence, whether it's in the home or it's on the street. It is still a crime.
I did forget to mention something at the start, and that is when I talk about family violence being a gendered issue in our communities, I just want to make it clear that I'm not labelling all Aboriginal men as perpetrators of violence, or trying to demonise them. And all I'm saying is that this is an issue for Aboriginal women, and men are the problem. It's not a race issue. So just for the women that we work with, some of the barriers are that a basic lack of understanding their legal rights when it comes to being a victim of family violence, and the work that we have to do in communities to ensure that women understand what an intervention order is, not to tell child protection too much, and what assistance they can get through compensation of victims of crime. We have to go, do the really hard yards to ensure that our women in our communities understand that stuff. The poor police responses in our communities are huge barriers for our women. We have, there is just an absolute lack of, there is an absolute fear and lack of trust in the system generally with our women, and to have our women walk into a police station to report the violence and then have a police officer say to her, "He just punched you in the head this time. It's not as bad as last time, go home." That's not doing much for encouraging women to disclose violence. It also, when we have women going to report violence, they're often, not often, but sometimes police will bring a warrant out and say, "We have this out for your arrest." So we're trying to deal with those kind of issues, but we do have some fantastic projects that need funding, like working with police to build relationships between community and police, to develop protocols for when they receive a report of family violence. The other thing too is the child protection workers, that system really fails our women, and they're often told by the workers that they don't need to have legal advice and everything will be okay, and before we know it, kids are taken and it's really hard to get them back.
Paul, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think for me the two biggest barriers are a simplistic analysis of the circumstance and then a failure to properly respond in the light of the knowledge that comes from a deep and proper analysis. And what I mean by that is when we released our theory for change, our emerging theory of change and our strategy in September last year, we talked about trying to pursue a multi-layered and mutually reinforcing approach. So we need to understand, as the panel has suggested this afternoon, that the problem is societal, so it is cultural and it is structural. It is it exists at a local community level and it exists at a personal level. And similarly, if we only invest in response services, or if we only invest in primary prevention, or if we only invest in early intervention, then we will fail. So there's no simple solution or one solution to a complex, long-standing, and in policy terms, a wicked problem. That's not a moral term. It means where traditional responses have failed to change the course of events. So we need to acknowledge the complexity. We need to have a comprehensive response across prevention, across early intervention and response services. We need to know that demands on the system will grow as we move forward, and our investment in response systems needs to grow accordingly. And we need to learn as we develop new ways of engaging community and new ways of responding to women and their children. So evaluation and research are absolutely key to that. And we need to change our responses in the light of that evidence.
This is an issue that the sector's obviously been fighting on for decades. Right now it feels like there's a window, at least politically, where if we campaign and mobilise smartly, we could drive some significant change. What do the panel think we need to be doing to generate a race to the top on domestic violence policy in Australia?
Well, obviously the Royal Commission's a good opportunity, at least in Victoria, and it'd be great to see many people putting in submissions. Doesn't have to be anything sensational or elaborate, but just different people's input, I think would be really good. Nationally, we actually have a really good policy. It's long-term, it's bipartisan, but the extent to which it can be effective is the extent to which governments commit to it. And so far, it's been going 5 years. It's intended to reduce the rates of women being murdered, and as Rosie mentioned before, that's doubled. It's meant to reduce the rates of incidents, and in Victoria at least there were 65,000 police attendances last year, which is double what it was in 2009. And we've had so many women murdered this year and children that there's been a real groundswell for some sort of national summit, and the Prime Minister committed to looking at this at COAG. And one of the things that's come out of that meeting is a national intervention order scheme, and that's important in relation to women who might have to travel interstate, not having to go through the same process again in another state to get their intervention order recognised there, where it might be more difficult. But in terms of what the federal government could be doing, it's pretty low-hanging fruit. And it's part of the national plan. It's been part of the national plan, since its inception. The government's been talking about it for a long time. So I think while we've actually got a really good policy, but I think it's up to us as a community to let government know about our expectations. Government can be doing so many more things. Federally, there's the review that was undertaken on the Australian Law Reform Commission did on the intersection between family court and state jurisdictions, the intersection between federal and state laws on a number of different issues in relation to violence against women. Those really need to be implemented. The experience of women in family court I think is really shameful. We need to be doing so much more in that sphere. So I think it's about us as a community really galvanising and putting pressure on government about our expectations that policy isn't just developed, it's actually delivered. And I think right now we run the risk of a lot of sort of activities, a lot of sort of one-off events and talking and everything. But at the end of this year, when Rosie's no longer Australian of the Year, the Royal Commission's done, really nothing much changing. So it would be great to see people getting involved in different campaigns. Fair Agenda have a terrific campaign calling on government, particularly in relation to gender equity. But also connecting. If you're thinking of doing things yourself, it's really great to connect with organisations already working in this space so that we're not duplicating or running at odds with one another.
I agree with everything that Fiona said, and I also would like to add that I talked about long-term investment and commitment from the government, and we are calling for the reinstatement of our National Family Violence Prevention Legal Service program, which was taken in under the IAS, so that doesn't exist anymore. So essentially the government has made no commitment to addressing the high rates of family violence in Aboriginal communities. I think that with this second National Action Plan too, one of the things in that that it proposes to reduce violence in Aboriginal communities is to put more police in communities, and that's simply not the answer. And it's absolutely essential that Aboriginal women or family violence services, specialist services, are consulted in those major plans. And also the COAG committee, which is co-chaired by Rosie and Ken Lay, it's absolutely essential that there's an Aboriginal women's voice on that committee, and an Aboriginal women's voice with expertise in family violence. So we're calling for that, and it's just absolutely essential that Aboriginal women's voices are heard and that Aboriginal women don't remain invisible to policymakers.
Certainly we've really got to keep the pressure on the government. We have a certain degree of momentum that has been building. We cannot afford it to diminish. We've got to really, while there's this moment in time, to force the government to acknowledge this huge epidemic. When you consider how much resources and funding are thrown at the threat of terrorism, when you look at the real threats here in Australia, terrorism, as frightening as it is not, it's a real disparity between what we invest in the terrorism that's happening in our own communities and how we view it so much more seriously, it seems, when it happens elsewhere. It is a real threat to the government too, with the culture and the way they like to conduct themselves, their behaviour in Parliament, the way that they speak to each other. It's not respectful relationships. They're not great role models. It takes a huge cultural shift for them personally. They have to let go of a lot of things that a sense of privilege and entitlement that perhaps rocks them too. So, it is about making sure that we work collaboratively together, that as Fiona said, if you are looking to look at programs where that you see in your own communities that are raising awareness or meeting a need in your community, to check in with the peak bodies to see what else is being done elsewhere, that you can perhaps tap into that expertise or join resources rather than duplicating efforts, because from where I sit there's a lot of fragmentation in the sector. We need to really learn how to work really powerfully together. We need to get, I suppose, that energised, because, for so long it's been a huge battle where I know that I feel fortunate that my voice is heard, but I know that it's only heard because Luke got murdered. Otherwise I wouldn't be where I am now. And, the likes of Fiona and Antoinette and Paul, who've been in this sector for a very, very long time, battling away, probably thinking at some point never going to get anywhere where we need to be. But this is the time where I think we are ready to actually say we recognise the problem, we're not going to let stand by anymore. And I think it is about taking responsibility individually for the part that you can play. Certainly the government has a huge responsibility, but I think sometimes we have to drive that, vote with our feet, demand action from your local politicians, and be active in that space.
So 2 comments. First, if it's a race, we'll fail because, we're talking about a societal issue. Societal issues don't respect jurisdictions and these artificial lines on a sort of national map. And we need collaboration across jurisdictions. Because we live in this shared soup of misogyny and sexism and structural inequality, and no one state or territory or a federal government acting unilaterally can overcome that. So that's the first. We need collaboration, we need cooperation, and we need to be able to work together and to pool strategies and resources. Secondly, if it is a race, if that analogy holds, then it's a marathon, not a sprint. And we need some really clear markers about to know that we're getting there. So civil society can't solve the problem on its own. Community organisations can't, and nor can governments. All of them have to work together, and if we have a fantastic national plan. The world looks at Australia for this unprecedented collaboration across multiple levels of government, committing over 12 years to an ambitious and aspirational target or goal of ending violence against women and their children, and a commitment to refresh that every 3 years. But we need to take that further, and we need to be able to set clear targets along the way. And this is something publicly, in public policy, we're often loath to do, because if we set a hard or a fixed target of achievement, then if we don't get there, we're seen to fail. So that presents as a risk to many key stakeholders. But I think we can only wrestle with an issue of the dimensions that we're talking about this afternoon if we are bold enough to set those clear measures and targets. I mean, it's been done in the area of suicide, where groups have publicly argued for a 50% reduction in suicide in a given period. And we need to hold ourselves accountable in civil society, in community organisations and in public policy and governments to firm and clear targets.
In terms of tangible accountability and commitments from governments, in addition to the targets, are there any key funding asks that we should be rallying behind, or other things that we should be keeping an eye on, particularly with an eye to the upcoming federal budget and election?
Well, yeah, we might be a bit late for the federal budget, but I think that one of the things we're calling for is a dedicated violence against women funding stream, because this issue is kind of funded as though it's incidental or temporary, and most of the funding that we have, at least in the family violence sector, comes from homelessness dollars, and that means that our requirements for gathering data are mainly linked to homelessness. So I agree with Paul in terms of setting targets, but it will be difficult setting targets if we're not actually gathering data that's useful, and there's so many different groups of women who are completely invisible in our data, like women with disabilities. Aboriginal women are nowhere near visible. How do we actually develop strategies and measure the impact of interventions if we don't even have any sort of relevant data to measuring whether we are in fact making any difference? So I think a dedicated funding stream. The other reason why we're calling for it is, you know, we've had so many murders this year, an average 2 a week, and for us as the peak body for women's services in Victoria, we've spent most of this year fighting funding cuts. So it would be really great to have a dedicated funding stream that looked at, you know, prevention, early intervention, crisis responses, really great post-crisis responses that gave this the priority and attention and focus that it needs. The other urgent ask, I think, is the requirement from government to build systems approaches to perpetrator accountability. And perpetrator accountability is kind of a jargon term that we use in the sector. When I first heard it, I thought of like this to men, you know. But I guess it means that we're not, as a system, gathering intelligence on men who choose to use violence. We're not sharing that data across different sectors: women's services, men's services, child protection, courts, corrections, etc. And what that means is that while women are experiencing family violence, they're generally dealing with the risk by themselves. So they're having to, in between going to court or contacting police, they're pretty much left to dealing with it themselves. And the cause of the problem is left unaddressed. And it's interesting how culturally we've got this real resistance to holding men to account when they choose to use violence, or a culture of making excuses, and the system's kind of set up in the same way. They're not even in the picture. So I think developing ways in which we are bringing these men into the picture and ensuring that, I mean, most of our system, we've assessed the system responding to violence against women, about 50% of that would be post-separation violence, because this concept of retribution that men who choose to use violence have, their male privilege, that they get to pay back women for leaving, and they will make their lives hell, and they do. And so we really need to, I think, be really paying that attention and addressing that in a systematic way so that women and children can actually end a relationship, or women can end a relationship and be safe. It's a fundamental human right.
Did you want me to say something?
I wanted you to take it.
Well, I did call for the reinstatement of our National Family Violence Prevention Legal Service program, which was a small $23.2 million that, you know, we were told there were going to be greater opportunities under the Indigenous Advancement Strategy, and we've ended up with that amount for the next 2 years at least. But why not a Royal Commission nationally into family violence? I'm not sure if you've heard of the work of the Victorian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commissioner for Children and Young People. His work in Task Force 1000, where he's reviewing every file of Aboriginal children, an Aboriginal child in care, and the evidence is showing now that more than 95% of those children in care are there because of family violence. So why not a Royal Commission into the removal of Aboriginal children as well?
So what are the policy asks that we should be pushing? Well, I think there's areas where we can make decisions that are binding, and I think there's other areas that we want to influence. So, and in those areas we have to encourage and create carrots in some ways. You know, in our public services, we can set minimum standards in terms of women being in 50% of leadership positions, and public boards and authorities mirroring that as well in terms of appointment policies. I think in corporate sector we need to encourage and reward and celebrate what we see as best practice, where we have an alignment of workplace policies and equal opportunity practice that allow for that. Workplace policies that respect and acknowledge that employees experience family and domestic violence, and there are particular provisions for them. And similarly, in terms of leadership and directorships in corporate organisations, we should be celebrating where the standard that we can proclaim in the public sector and the community sector is achieved in the corporate sector. I think the other policy ask is our next generation, our children and young people, and historically there's a focus on respectful relationships education in secondary schools, and I think we should explore how we can do that more effectively in primary schools and in early childhood, because we know that lifetime values are formed from early childhood. We know that relationships are explored and played out in primary school, and that's where those conversations need to be having, as well as in secondary schools. And I also think a key area is just coming to grips where values are formed today. So they are influenced by family, by neighbourhood, by peers, by the school environment. But more importantly, they're informed by the online world, by social media. And we need to be much more competent in our deliberate interventions into that space and in our conversations in that space. So, and we need to engage the industries that support that space. So the portrayal of women in contemporary games as victims, the use of women as wallpaper in the background of games, always stereotyped as the victim and pleading for mercy in games that involve violence and conflict. Those things have to change, and the corporate interests that promote that have to develop standards and ways of moving beyond that. And our engagement and conversation with young people, we've relaunched The Line today, that social media platform for young people 12 to 20 years of age. We have to continue to build on the good work that's gone before and get better and better in that space, so that we can bring the positive engagements and conversations to stand alongside the other influences that I've just described.
So final question before we'll take some from the audience. So obviously this is a really complex issue, and there are people like yourselves who have quite specialist experience and expertise. What is the most useful thing that we as organisations or individuals without that deep expertise can do to tackle this issue? If there's anything you haven't spoken to already that you'd like to add?
I'd only add I think there's so much that the community can do. I think challenging sexism in the way in which we challenge racism or homophobia, in the way that we know that racism is linked to race-related violence and homophobia is linked to homophobic-related violence. We really need to develop people's understanding about the links between sexism and violence against women, and that's something, I think sometimes people think that they've got to wait until they see some sort of violent incident on the street. That's something that people can do to really support the work of creating a safer community. I think, vote with your feet, vote with your wallet. Sponsors listen to what the community say, are concerned with what the community say. Businesses care where we put our dollar. Government is concerned about our, constituency needs. So I think that government, people in the community really playing a role in that this is a really critical issue. That's all I've got.
Just for us, I guess, everything that Fiona has said, but ask yourself, are you culturally aware? Do you know the history of this country? As an Aboriginal woman and a CEO of an Aboriginal community-controlled organisation, I've committed to ongoing cultural awareness training for all of our staff, and even as an Aboriginal woman, I learn something new every time I participate in that, so it's really, really important. And get to know your Aboriginal community that you live in, the Aboriginal services, get to know us. I'm throwing it out there, we've got Facebook pages, we've got social media, follow us, get involved. And lastly, I just can't walk away from here without saying you've just got to get behind stopping the forced closures of our communities.
Rosie and Paul?
Is it on? I keep fiddling with it and don't know whether it's on or it's off, sorry. I think understanding that unless you have specialised knowledge and have specialised training, you are not specialists. And to recognise that it is the specialised family violence services that truly understand, from my perspective and my experience, how to support you in a journey of understanding your position, understanding the safety or the sense of danger that you may be in. So what I would like to see is organisations have a higher degree of training and understanding in family violence issues. It was really disturbing to me about a year ago to find that some organisations in the welfare sector wanted some family violence training, and one of their first questions is, why doesn't she leave? If we have that in the welfare sector as a judgment or question, I really feel dismayed, so I think we have an obligation to learn as much as we can when we are dealing with vulnerable people in our service as a service provider, to have a very, very good understanding of family violence. Currently, I know that I did a diploma in community welfare. It isn't a core subject. Most qualifications in most professions, it's actually barely discussed to any great meaningful level. So it's really, I think, important for organisations and individuals to really seek out expert training. And also, one of the things that I experienced is the lack of organisations that could be involved with victims who don't know how to do risk assessments, who actually don't engage properly with their clients as to what is their risk assessment. Do they know what one is? Do they know when to do it? Do they think it's relevant within the organisation they're working in? So, you know, certainly I feel that everybody who's dealing with vulnerable people should have a very good understanding, a very deep understanding, training in family violence, and it should be ongoing. And I think that, you know, that's something that I think is really important and something that I found very lacking, and I found equally disturbing that when I was dealing with specialised police services, their knowledge of violence was less than mine, and I wasn't working in a specialised unit. Those similarly, child protection, don't necessarily work with the same risk assessment and understanding of danger towards women and children. So we all have a responsibility to be informed, to be without judgment, to be without criticism, because when you feel it, when you sense it as a victim, it's really a very unfair place to be.
I think the first is that we have to respect the voices of women and children who have experienced family and domestic violence, and we have to respect the people on whose shoulders we stand that we can have this conversation today. So the women who have been the advocates, who have led the women's movement, who for 40 years have struggled to try and make the hidden issue that was very real to them a public conversation. And we need to try and bring respect to all of our engagement. Secondly, I guess I'm not speaking with you today as an expert. Although I've worked for 30 years to try and realise social justice in many areas in our community, I've had to look in the mirror as I've accepted the responsibilities at Our Watch, and it's a confronting stare, and that's something that every individual, regardless of the budget you're responsible for or your role in an organisation or your part in community, that you can do, is look in the mirror and understand the nature of relationships and the sexism that you can unintentionally perpetuate and unwittingly collude with in your everyday interaction as a partner, as a parent, as a friend, as a brother, as a sibling. And then I think finally that we can look for alignment. So the world that we hope to bring about in our personal interactions, we hope to bring about in our workplaces, we hope to bring about where community gathers, whether it's in a church or a public hall, or whether it's in a sporting club or a recreational group. And we look for that alignment in our workplaces as well. So respect, looking honestly in the mirror, and we're looking for alignment. I think wherever we are, whoever we are, we can seek to realise those three things.
Thank you. We've got about 5 minutes left, so what I might do is take 3 questions from the audience and then throw them to the panel and then see how much time we've got left. So this woman on the end here, second row, yep, and the lady in the scarf with her hand up.
Thank you so much. I'm from YWCA in Adelaide, and Paul, I was really interested to hear you say the importance of respectful relationships programs in schools, particularly in primary schools, because YWCA Adelaide, in partnership with Canberra, actually developed a respectful relationships program for primary school students under the first national plan funding that came out. We piloted it, we evaluated it, and it was proven to increase gender equitable attitudes, amongst other things. And of course that funding ran out and we now have no funding for it. So my question, I guess, is how can we as a sector sort of capture the collective knowledge that we have so that each time a new funding cycle comes out, we're not being told, oh, we need innovation, and they fund new programs who haven't been tried and tested, and we keep losing the collective knowledge that we have.
Yeah, thanks. The second question?
Has domestic violence increased due to unemployment?
Okay.
I think we should answer one question.
Okay.
Because I don't know if
Sure.
people can remember the answer.
Okay, yep, let's do that. Does anyone want to respond to the first question? Paul?
So YWCA Adelaide, fantastic organisation with a great reputation in this space, ending men's violence against women. Congratulations. You know, pilot programs are important, but pilot programs that generate evidence and prove change have to be sustained. So part of what we were arguing for before when talking about growing investment across prevention, across early intervention, response and longer term support services is about taking pilot programs that are proven to scale. And in some areas we're very dependent on, and respectful programs in schools generally are very dependent upon school communities and principals making informed choices about which educators and programs to engage. And so one of the things I'd be very keen to see is national standards that are developed that sit behind those programs that can inform the choices of people who are bringing those programs into school communities. Because we do have some fantastic programs, but we don't have them at scale.
Thanks. Does anyone want to respond to the second question about the link between violence and unemployment?
What was the second question?
About whether or not there was...
Has domestic violence increased in the last couple of years due to unemployment?
It's difficult to tell specifically about what drives increases because we don't have the benchmark data. So in terms of measuring it, it's very difficult because it's historically been an underreported crime. But when we look at the data, there are about, the kind of experiences, what's generated the violence. Some have unemployment issues, not all of them. Some have mental health issues, not all of them. Some have drug and alcohol issues, not all of them. But the most common denominator is gender. This is primarily something that's perpetrated by men and where women and children are predominantly women. And that's because of the social, I'm the mother of two sons, and when they were young I used to think, oh, what does that mean? That we've got no hope, that maybe there's something inherently evil, about men. But actually it's not genetic, it's not biological at all. It's those social conditions, the social inequality between men and women. So the UNIFEM research that shows that violence against women occurs in communities across the world to a greater or lesser extent because of those factors of gender equality. And of course the conditions that allows it to flourish, those attitudes, supports it. So that's fundamentally the driver. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just interested in the panel's reflection on the issue of actually embedding action towards gender equity in the community. I work for a women's health service. We do a lot of prevention work, and I'd say despite significant evidence, there is a deep resistance within the community and stakeholders we work with to gender equity as a solution to family violence. How do we deepen that understanding amongst stakeholders who aren't specialists, who perhaps don't perceive themselves as being kind of pure actors in the space, and not just increase our reach, so we're talking to 1,500 people, but actually get 50 people who really get what the solution should be and who set about taking that action in their own organisations?
I think you've hit a nail on the head that people struggle to make the connection between gender inequality and family and domestic violence. As Fiona said, there is a very strong international evidence base, and the two key drivers of are gender inequality and communities that rigidly hold to traditional gender stereotypes. There are a number of other contributors, and alcohol and unemployment and long-term poverty can be those contributors, but they're not the core drivers. So how do we affect change, and how do we understand a broad-based population level understanding of that dynamic? I think it's got to be multi-layered. So I think, and again, this is what we tried to articulate in our strategy. It's got to be a sustained, constructive public conversation, and key leaders in our community have to step up to hold that conversation and be a part of it. But that on its own won't change, so we have to link to that population-wide behaviour change, attitudinal change programs that are brought about because of the sort of public permission that conversation gives. And our governments have to contribute significantly to finance and to resource those change programs over an extended period. And then if we're going to be multi-layered, something that's happening across the Australian community has to be reinforced by activity at a community level and at a neighbourhood or personal or family level. So we need to resource and invest in that, and you and your community do need to find the 50 champions who can take that conversation into their community clubs and associations, into their neighbourhood, into their informal networks and into local workplaces. And we need to create the environment, if they're public workplaces in the sense they're connected with community organisations or public sector organisations, then I think we've talked about this afternoon the sorts of standards or targets we should aim for or require. And if they're independent and private organisations, then we need ultimately to set compliance obligations. But whilst we're on the journey to that point, let's celebrate the people who are affecting change. You know, the workplaces who have the EBAs, who provide for family and domestic violence clauses and have workplace policies that make that as possible. So both carrot and stick will get us there in those settings.
I think I wanted to add what an important part the media can play in this. Certainly they have huge influence, either negatively or positively. And I think what we've seen, I think you'd agree that we've seen a huge improvement in the reporting of family violence. We've got a lot of work, I know that all you guys have done with working with the media closely to try and influence the way that they position the stories and how they portray women. They have enormous influence, and we need to take them on that journey too, because if we're going to continue to place pressure on governments, they were instrumental too in the reversal of the funding cuts. They totally support, what we were trying to achieve, and I think that certainly they are a huge part of the journey towards influencing change as well, if we use it correctly.
It's frustrating, isn't it? I guess it's kind of evidence of how deeply sexist we actually are, that the women's organisations who hold the expertise around this and have for years and years aren't necessarily acknowledged by colleague organisations as having that expertise. I think one of the difficulties that we've got is that we've been working in a policy vacuum. We still are. So we don't really have any kind of levers to bring people to the table. And I think what we really need, at least in Victoria, is an evidence-based strategy, both for a discrete one for primary prevention and a discrete one for response, the response end, that brings together, that actually articulates where we need to head the objective, and each sector's role in delivering that. And it would be great to see a prevention strategy that articulated the need for different organisations to build capacity around gender equity, etc. That could actually, rather than it just be about your organisation's ideas versus others, you've actually got those levers to drive people to be at the table.
Super quickly, before we wrap up, I just wanted to say if people are interested in joining kind of public mobilisation around respectful reporting in the media and funding of family violence services, you can sign up to a campaign on Fair Agenda. I just want to close by thanking very much all our panellists for making the time to be with us today. Please join me in giving them a big thank you.